In the last 100 days, we survived the deadliest of alien-like creatures that sought no other purpose but to end our lives. As we survive, we must strive for the ultimate goals, becoming an interplanetary species and defeating every boss that holds our solar system captive, and crafting the ultimate armor set that will allow us to kill the most powerful Titan of all, the Chaos Guardian. Every day we wait, time ticks, and the difficulty meter goes up. We must face the Guardian before the difficulty is too high, or else all will be lost, and our survival will be for nothing. Let's begin. Thank you guys so much for the support. I've been playing modded Minecraft since I had a laptop that ran Sky Factory at 3 FPS. You're truly making my dreams come true. Because of how much this channel is blowing up, I wanted to make sure I was giving back to the community, and to do so, I started a new vlog channel. I'm going to be hosting some charity streams and giving some of my own money from these channels to help out people in need. If you want to become a part of this, I'll be showing some of it in my first vlog when it comes out. The link is in the description. Day 101. I decided that my next task would be going to the moon. So to prepare for that, I was going to collect all the ores I had gathered from my void ore miners and begin smelting them down. I didn't have a big enough smeltery at the time, so I began dismantling my current smeltery so I could smelt more ores at the same time. Going to the moon was going to be a resource-intensive job, but once there, we could begin exploring the dungeons and the many bosses it has to offer as we escape to the other planets and begin our quest for solar dominance. I then ventured into the nether to collect some blaze rods. If I was going to ramp up my industry so I could go to the moon, I was going to need a lot more ender chests, and blaze rods were essential for that crafting. Whilst exploring the nether, I found this cute little house. This man decided to make his bed out of past people's souls. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. I began the next day by processing some resources. I was going to spend this day expanding my reactors. I was going to need more power if I was going to get more machines going so I could get to the moon. I started out the next day by replacing my chests with some ender chests. This way my items could be automatically imported into my computer system. This saves a lot of time transferring the items back and forth and will ultimately be the endgame solution for how we're going to process all of our ores. I then began the construction of my Tier 2 ore miner. This would mine ores at a lot faster of a rate than my Tier 1s. It would also mine some more rare ores. This was going to be the ultimate production machine and was going to lead me to the moon even quicker. The next day, my island was invaded by these dual-wielding Cyclopses, so I made quick work of them. I convinced them it would be a great idea to walk off the edge and make their new home on the ground, and they listened to me. I ended off the day by making a circuit fabricator and a compressor. These were the beginning elements that would make my Tier 1 rocket, which would allow me to visit the moon and begin dungeoning there. The next day, the compressor made some plates for me, and with those plates I was able to make a NASA workbench. From there, I made some more compressors so I could get some more plates faster and begin the construction of my rocket. I then created some oxygen tanks. This would allow me to breathe when I was on the moon and not immediately suffocate and die. I spent the next day using my compressors, and eventually I was able to make Tier 1 rocket parts, and I made my Tier 1 rocket. I was ready now to go to the moon. Well, almost ready. I then made my launch pad parts, which you need to form in a 3x3 grid, and then I attached my fuel loader to it, only to realize I need fuel to load. Fancy that. I began the next day by questing for some oil. I was able to find it inside of the caves. It has a better spawn chance in the desert and underground. After accumulating it, I made what's called a refinery. The refinery will take the crude oil and make it into refined petroleum, and then from there, you can put it into buckets, put it into your fuel loader, and begin to load your rocket. I also made a wireless transceiver. This would allow me to power anything I was wearing or holding while I was away from my house. I would never have to worry about my jetpack running out of fuel or anything else. It's a great item. And then, after my rocket was loaded, blast-off occurred. I was going to be the interstellar being of magnificence. I was going to take over all the other planets, including Earth. I don't know if it's a big deal that my rocket is shaking violently. I'm sure this is fine. No death will occur. Whilst I was plummeting to the moon at 10 meters per second, I was thinking to myself, I probably should have done some training before I went to the moon. But then I was like, it's just the moon. What can happen? The next day, after the game warned me that my oxygen setup is invalid, which I invalidated myself because my oxygen was going down, therefore I believed I was fine. I ventured into the dungeons to find the boss that held the moon captive. After I took him out, I'd be able to get a Tier 2 rocket schematic, and I could go to Mars because the moon is lame. But unfortunately, after slaying the first boss, he gave me a moon buggy schematic. What am I supposed to do with this? Oh, never mind, I got a really good idea. The next day, I found another dungeon and I plunged inside without even a second thought, including the second thought about my oxygen levels. I then began fighting all the zombies and spiders. My only thought was, who gave these guys space helmets? But then I thought, I'll just kill them anyway. And then I found the boss once again, and I began to attack him. Whoever designed this dungeon forgot about the fact that you might be able to fly, and I was able to bow him down and defeat him. I then went to his chest, and sure enough, there was a Tier 2 rocket schematic. I was almost done on the moon. It was time to venture to Mars. My last goal on the moon was to collect some meteors. They drop meteoric iron, and from that, I could craft my Tier 2 rocket. But they spawned very infrequently, so I had to wait for them to spawn, and then I could mine them up. I began the next day by venturing into the Nether. I wasn't after blaze rods this time, I was after wither skulls. I wanted to create some seeds for my silicone and for my meteoric iron. This way I could grow it and I never have to mine it again. But to get those seeds, I was going to need to kill a wither. The wither drops supremium essence, and from there, I can craft it down into intermedium essence, which is required for the silicone seeds. When I arrived home, I spawned in the wither, and I began my assault. I took him down, and I claimed his nether star and his 1 supremium essence. He used to drop 2. I wonder who toned that down. I then crafted my silicone seeds. This would not only help me with my ventures to the moon, but would also help me with my storage crafting for my refined computer. The next day, after planting my silicone seed, I decided I wanted to work on the processing of ores. If I was going to be venturing to different planets and collecting different minerals and slaying bosses, I was going to need a big backbone of resources. But to do that, I was going to need a resourcing plant and to take in a lot of resources at a very fast pace. The next day, I began the creation of my new processing plant. This was going to function for all the resources incoming into my base and the processing and exporting and importing of those resources. I was going to be importing mad resources as the game progressed, so I needed the building to be large so I could take in everything that was happening and able to process it in an efficient time manner. I then began the creation of a spawner that would automatically spawn in blazes, and I could harvest them for their blaze rods. This would enable me to make many ender chests and begin my automation process. I built a tiny little holding cell for all these creatures to live in. This would enable them to spawn in small quantities, and then I could harvest them for all of their goods. Haha, I'm not evil at all. I started out the next day by populating my new processing plant with some pulverizers and furnaces. Pulverizers would duplicate the ore input, import them into the furnaces would then smelt them, and import them back into my computer system. Perfect. Except these things work very slowly, so they're only going to work for the first bit. Later, we're going to have to come up with a more complicated solution to process all of our ores. I knew I was going to need a lot of redstone and quartz for the upcoming machines, so I began to get them pulverized so I get the max quantity without using Fortune 3. Manual labor is for simps, after all. I also found a Blizz nearby, and I decided to trap him in a soul vial. This way I could duplicate him later if I wanted some Blizz powder. I then began the creation of my new import, export, and tech area. This would allow me to manage everything in one place. I began the next day by finishing up the importing, exporting, and tech area. I then wrapped cables all around the base. This way I could connect anything around the perimeter. I would eventually expand this, but I was going to keep it small for now. I then moved my ME system over so everything was in one place. And then I activated the pulverizers and iron now that they could be imported right to my computer. This was the beginning of ultimate automation, and now I could begin focusing on ore processing and going to Mars. After slaying some mobs that managed to spawn inside of my new processing plant, one of them dropped this battle axe. I decided to use it as it did more damage than my diamond sword. I'm not exactly sure what mod it's from, but it looks pretty pog. I began the next day by working on a wireless crafting grid. I didn't always want to have to come back to my mainframe whenever I wanted to click on supplies or craft something on the go. This would allow me to craft and access my inventory from anywhere on the map. It's absolutely pog. Whilst I was roaming around my base, I noticed some epic items inside of my processing plant, but I had not put them there, and there was really no way for them to get there. Unless somehow the blazes were dropping them in there, which gave me the idea I should probably look and see what the blazes are dropping, just out of curiosity. Upon checking my computer system, I found out they were dropping a ton of loot bags, and I decided to see what was inside. While I was opening the bags, I got some absolutely epic items, mainly mystical agriculture seeds, which is insanely good that I got them now, and I didn't have to grind for them later, because each seed will eventually duplicate itself, and you can actually make an entire farm out of it, and you can get the ores from there. Things like vibrant alloy are a pain in the butt to make, but now I can get infinite resources of them. Whilst opening some of the loot bags, I got these epic rings. I was hoping that I could put them on as baubles of sorts, and they would give me their related effects, but unfortunately you actually have to be holding the ring for it to give it the effect. It's not that great, but maybe it'll come in use later. I then used some bone meal on these wooden seeds to give me some wooden essence. Wooden essence can then be transformed into actual wood. Any type of wood type that you want, you can transform it into, and it's absolutely pog. Unfortunately, I don't have too much of it, but it'll help me get a start on my new design. The next day, I crafted some growth pulsers. You can put this below any type of crop and it'll grow a lot faster. I put it below my inferium seeds so that my inferium would grow a lot faster, and then I could make even more growth pulsers. I then began to set up my pulverizers. This would process ores such as diamonds and emeralds that only need to be pulverized and not smelted. I then decided I wanted to venture out and go into some dungeons and find some more seeds. It's very easy to find seeds inside of these dungeons, and although they're extremely dangerous, my wyvern armor is enough to protect me for a little while. But while on my way, I found this very odd mineshaft area. I'm not sure if this was supposed to be a mineshaft, or if there's just oak logs here, but it's very strange. I then ventured into the dungeons, and although the mobs were definitely packing a punch, my wyvern armor was able to stand up for a little while, and I was able to loot some of the chests. We didn't get any too notable seeds, but we did get some that would help us progress our farms and advance to the next stage. I knew the next step would be going to Mars, as defeating the Chaos Dragon at this point was a little bit out of our reach. We were going to have to make much better armor, but before doing that, I wanted to explore some more planets and see what bosses they had to offer and what loot they had to offer with them. When I arrived home, I began opening some loot bags. That's become quite fun to do. After that, I began processing some unique ores. I would need these ores to build some more farming stations. Once everything was built, I wanted to then go to Mars and begin exploring what it had to offer. I began the day by placing a farming station down on my new farming pad. I was going to layer these pads on top of each other and create an economic powerhouse using mystical agriculture. I was going to create every single crop inside of the game and have ores processing like a madman. This game was mine. To build the next layer, I was going to need more dirt. The next layer was going to be an assortment of crops, but eventually every single layer would be its own crop type. This would be absolutely pog for the end game because we would have so many resources coming in from our ore miners and our mystical agriculture combined that we could create anything that we wanted. I ended off the day by destroying all of my void ore miners from the tier 1 slot. I was going to upgrade them to tier 2, as one tier 2 ore miner with max upgrades is better than 3 tier 1s. I then began the next day by adding my speed modifiers to my new void ore miners. I knew if I was going to fight the Titan by day 200, and the Chaos Dragon before that, and take over all the planets even before that, I was going to need a lot of resources, and I was going to need them quickly. Began the next day by destroying my farm and transferring it to the new farmland. I wanted it in a bigger space so that we could begin expanding it, getting more seeds. Once we got enough of a seed type, it could become its own farm, and we could get all the resources we needed from that specific seed. Specifically, I wanted diamonds, because as soon as I got diamonds, I could have growth pulsers, which would increase all the other farms. I then moved on to making an endstone layer. This would be for all of the enderpearl seeds. I wanted to have enderpearl seeds rather than an enderman farm, just because it creates less lag. I then crafted a pattern grid. This was the first item that would be essential into automating crafting. If I was going to be importing a ton of resources, I was going to need a way to store them all, and I wasn't going to manually make more storage every time. What do you think I am, a peasant? The next day, I began work on some aesthetics around the farm when I was attacked by another one of those scout dragons. I thought I killed their mother. I'm not quite sure why they keep attacking me. I then crafted a processing pattern. There are two types of patterns. There's a crafting pattern and a processing pattern. The difference between them is a processing pattern is anything that needs to go through a furnace or anything like that, whereas a crafting pattern is something that can just be crafted without using an exterior machine. The first material I decided to auto-craft was going to be a basic processor, which required processing and crafting. Once I clicked on it, I crossed my fingers and waited to hope I had the right items inside of my crafters, and sure enough, there it was, my first automatically crafted item. To end off the day, I ran into the nether and I grabbed a wither skeleton inside of my soul. I began the next day by combining my wither skeleton into a spawner and then into a powered spawner. I wanted to make a wither skeleton farm because as soon as I had skulls, I could make nether stars. And with nether stars, I could make tier 4 void ore miners. This would be essential if I wanted enough resources to go to every single planet inside of the solar system and then to eventually take on the remaining Titan inside of this world. I spent the next few days compiling the plates I would need to make a tier 2 rocket. A tier 2 rocket is required if I want to go to Mars, but to go to Mars we need the meteoric iron from the moon. The meteoric iron can then be compressed into plates. We combine the plates with a tier 1 rocket plating, and we get a tier 2 rocket plating, and from there we can make our tier 2 rocket. I wanted to go to Mars because the dungeons it has on it hold some loot that helps us expand to other planets. Once we can go to other planets, we can begin getting some epic loot and fighting even more bosses. This will help us progress in the game and advance our technology. I then decided to make a moon buggy so I could drive around on Mars and run over everything in my way. And then, on day 126, we launched ourselves back into space, propelling at mad speeds to arrive on Mars. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect on Mars as I hadn't played with this mod for a very long time, but I knew there was a boss that held the planet captive and we'd have to defeat him if we wanted the schematics to begin exploring outer space. I then made my way down to the surface of Mars. I was going to begin exploring for that dungeon. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I figured, hey, if an entire planet is red, something must stand out, right? And then after a few days of searching, I found the dungeon that I believed I was looking for. If I recall, there's a giant creeper that guards this domain, and I knew I was going to have to take him on if I wanted to unlock the schematics for the next tier of rocket. So I made my way through the dungeon, killing every mob I could find, until finally I found the boss room. I then began fighting the evolved creeper boss. The only way to kill him is to launch the TNT that he launches at you and back at him. I'm not exactly sure on the physics of this, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I then discovered that every time he hits one of his little eggs around his room, he spawns in these mini creepers that do a lot of damage, and I actually had to back out one of the times or I would have died. After letting my armor regenerate, I made my way back in and I began spamming the TNT back at him. I figured it was a good strategy if I were to stay right in front of him and not move around as much. This way he couldn't activate his little creeper eggs and I'd be a lot safer. And eventually, I brought him down and he gave me the tier 2 dungeon key. Unfortunately, we did not get a tier 3 schematic, but there's more dungeons where that came from. I then decided it would be a fun idea to drive my car around Mars. Vroom vroom. And then at the peak of day 130, I decided it was time to return to Earth and continue my quest for absolute economical dominance on this planet. And other planets for that matter. What? You know what? The whole solar system. I spent the next day working on the molecular transformer. I wanted to start getting nether stars in mass quantities as I would need it for tier 4 miners and for a lot of the draconic stuff. However, I came in with an issue. To get power into the molecular transformer, you needed a bunch of converters, and that was just inefficient. So I began researching a way to try and figure out how to get more power into this thing until I realized, well, let's put a flux point on it. So I put a flux point on it, and turns out that worked just fine. That was a waste of a day. The next day, I mainly just worked on auto-crafting. I set up a furnace for processing. You see, this way, I would never have to smelt anything manually again. I could simply request it through my computer system, and it would smelt through the furnace. This isn't the fastest furnace, but it's going to do for now, and later we'll upgrade it to an ultimate furnace for mystical agriculture. The next day, I began expanding my reactor. If I was going to expand my tier 4 void ore miner, I was going to need a lot more power. Also, my molecular transformer was a power-hungry beast. So I began expanding it by not taking down the current one, but by simply building around it. For those of you who know modded Minecraft, I apologize right now that I use lapis blocks as a coolant. After removing the lapis blocks as a coolant, because apparently they don't work, my reactor was finished and I was ready to output power. It did a solid 77,000 RF per tick, which would be just enough to power my ore miner and my molecular transformer at the same time. I began the next day by getting my patterns ready for a tier 4 void ore miner. You see, the reason I wanted this ore miner was to get resources even quicker, because the game difficulty was going up exponentially, and at this point, if I was going to fight a Chaos Dragon, I was going to need the best gear in the game, and I don't mean Draconic gear, and I think you know what I mean. And if I was going to acquire it, I was going to need every single bit of resources I could get, and every tier 4 ore miner I could get as well. While I was waiting for the resources to be collected to build the void ore miner, I went to the nether and began beheading skeletons. I was going to need a lot of skulls for nether stars, so I could actually build a tier 4 miner, as each block required one nether star to build. When I eventually got home, I began opening all the loot bags I had gotten. I had an idea that maybe an item was inside of the loot bag that I would need. Those infinity ingots I got earlier, I couldn't remember where I got them from, unfortunately. And I was trying to backtrack my steps because if I could find a way to get more of those ingots, we could fast track the end of this game. I began the next day by working on some upgrades for my thermal expansion machines. If I was going to have a tier 4 ore miner, I was going to have a backup of ores very quickly. So to process them all, I was going to need very fast units of processing. And to do that, I was going to upgrade them all the way up to Signelium, and then I was going to put augments of speed inside of them. I ended off the day by crafting some metallurgic infusers. I realized that my thermal expansion machines were definitely not fast enough to keep up with what was going on, and I was going to need some better machines. I started out the next day by working more on my metallurgic infusers and then expanding my farmland. I needed more Inferium seeds if I was going to actually start crafting those ultimate furnaces, which would be essential for automatic crafting. I then began the crafting process to make some elite enriching chambers. These chambers are absolutely amazing. They're like pulverizers on steroids, and you're about to see how awesome they are. As you can see, they can do up to 7 ores at once, and they're a lot faster than a pulverizer is after you put speed upgrades into it. And now all we needed to do was make an elite smelting factory, and then we'd have enough machines to process the current ore input until we expanded our void ore miners. I ended off the day by crafting some glowstone infused item ducts. This would allow me to transfer items even faster from the ender chest into my enriching factories, but unfortunately it was still not fast enough. I had to work on a workaround for this because I needed as many resources in there as I could get, because when the void ore miners were going at max capacity, I was going to need to process everything. The next day I began on a fix for my enrichment chambers. I knew the fastest way to be able to do this was going to be using export cables, but the only way I could use export cables would be by connecting the wires all the way from my computer system into my factory, and I really hate wires. But I ended up doing it anyway, and I put the export bus on top of the enrichment chambers, and this would almost immediately transfer items, which was definitely a better way than using the ender chests for short distances anyway. For some reason, Blaze kept escaping their little home base that was below my factory, and they lit my factory on fire. So after taking care of the blaze and the fire, I decided it would be a good idea to dismantle that spawner for now, as I had enough blaze rods for forever. I then deleted my furnaces and put in the elite smelting chambers. This would be absolutely amazing, because now I'd be able to process everything I was doing at max speeds. I would need to put more of these down if I was going to expand my void ore miners, but for now, this would work just fine. I began the next day by adding some speed upgrades into my enrichment chambers, and then I put the export busts onto the pulverizers, and everything was good to go and resources were flowing like a piece of cake. I then began to work on more mechanism and getting some special resources that were required to make a digital ore miner. This would help me solve the issue of the mobs that were consistently shooting at me from the ground. And then after crafting the ore miner, I placed it down and I started her up, and after doing some tinkering and figuring out how it worked, I was ready to start mining out the ground beneath me. You see, I figured if there was a giant hole around me, no one could actually shoot me from all the way down there. That was my great solution to the problem. I then began working on my Draconic Armor because I realized that even though the difficulty was scaling up, the damage did not increase that much, but I knew the Chaos Dragon's health would be absolutely crazy. So to take him on, I would need the ultimate sword, but for armor, Draconic would do just fine. So I figured if I could make a bunch of crystals, I could respawn the Ender Dragon, which would then give me a heart. From that heart, I could craft 4 Draconic blocks, and I would need a lot of Draconium if I wanted to make the ultimate set. I had discovered that Manelium blocks actually make end crystals. This way I wouldn't have to waste nether stars on the crafting of them. It would be much more efficient use of my resources. I then had a tiny spill, but no biggie. It's not to worry about, right? That'll go away. I ended off the day grabbing my dislocator from my ME system. I picked this up from a mob earlier in the game. It's absolutely amazing because it allows you to teleport using ender pearls across dimensions and anywhere inside of the world as long as you have a waypoint set there. When I arrived at the end and I began battling the Ender Dragon again, I realized he had way too much health because of the difficulty modifiers. Killing him was going to take forever, and I was not about that life, so I decided to go home and try and figure out a workaround to get more Draconium. I figured that the best way to get rare resources was going to be through loot bags, so I decided to set up a massive spawning system inside of the end, and then this way I could get all the loot bags I needed, have an automatic opener to open them, and get all the resources I could. And in this way, hopefully I would get some infinity ingots and some Draconium as well. I ended off with this for the farm design. It was quite ugly and quite ineffective, but it would work for now, and I would begin tweaking it a little bit later. I then set Mesmerized as this loot opener opened all the loot bags. This is just so fun to watch. The next day, I tried out this airship that I had gotten from a mob that I had killed. I tried placing it down, but I couldn't figure out how it worked. I tried looking up the controls, but I was scared to go off the edge that I would get instantly mauled by everything down there. So after failing to figure out how to fly it, I put it away for another time. I then began working on some auto-crafting, and my drives were filling up very fast with my new Tier 4 Void Ore Miner, and I needed more space, but I didn't want to craft Tier 4 drives because that seemed like a pain, so I decided to make an auto-crafting system for them instead. I began the next day by setting up my molecular transformer to automatically transform any Wither skeleton skulls into nether stars. I wanted to start exploring some other planets, so I wanted to make sure everything was fully automated before I left. I then set up an awakened draconium farm with 1 seed. You see, to make these things work, you need a dragon heart per seed that you plant, and since I'd only ever killed 1 dragon, I could only plant 1 seed. But never fear, we were going to have some workarounds to make this go a little bit faster. When I got back from the solar system, I wanted to have a lot of awakened draconium so I could make Draconic Armor and start taking on some of the bigger bosses inside of the Modpack. But to do that, I was going to need a lot of awakened draconium. So I had a simple idea. If I have a Fortune 3 hoe and I have acceleration wands going around it, then it should be able to have a fast enough output that I can get a lot of awakened draconium even though there's only 1 seed. So I began my process of making a Supremium hoe, which is unbreakable, and then adding Fortune 3 to it. And then just like that, the farm was ready. With growth pulsars under it, it would have the maximum efficiency for 1 seed. I began the next day by preparing my rocket to venture back to Mars. See, if I wanted to explore other planets and get some of the resources and bosses that they held, I was going to need a Tier 3 rocket. But to get a Tier 3 rocket, I was going to need a schematic that I could only get on the Mars dungeons. So I prepared my rocket, I blasted off, and I landed back onto Mars to find the next dungeon. After a little bit of searching, I was able to find another dungeon. I was crossing my fingers that this wasn't one I had done before, and sure enough it was not. And then I began my battle with the Creeper. Eventually I was able to take him down, but when I looted his chest, he did not have a Tier 3 schematic, which meant we needed to go kill another one and hope that he had a Tier 3 schematic in his chest. After a little bit more searching, we were able to find another Creeper boss and we took him down. And then we went to his rewards chest and sure enough, there was our Tier 3 rocket. We can now head back to Earth and begin preparing our new rocket to reach the outer planets. Before leaving Mars, we had to do one more thing. We had to accumulate some Dash ore. This would be required for making Tier 3 rocket parts which we would need to blast off to other planets. Next day, I began preparing all the plates I would need to craft the Tier 4 rocket. I put in every single plate imaginable, so I'd have everything that I would need and wouldn't have to go back to crafting. Whilst I was waiting for the plates to finish, I crafted a new ender chest and I made it green. This was going to export uranium. The uranium would then be automatically inputted into the reactor. This way I would never have to keep upkeeping it and putting uranium in it, and it would always have fuel and always be able to run. I had a bright idea that maybe the mystical agriculture fertilizer would work on the draconium seeds, but it did not. The next day, I began tinkering around with the idea of autonomous activators and using acceleration wands. I was getting these acceleration wands from loot bags, and I had no use for them aside of this. The autonomous activator acts as a right clicker. It'll automatically right click the acceleration wand onto the block in front of it. This way, I could accelerate the growth pulse and it would even be faster than it was before. The only problem with this is that the autonomous activators are very slow, so they don't right click very often, and it wasn't exactly an efficient way of doing it. I then went over to my compressors, and I made the final Tier 1 plates. From these plates, we can craft any other plate inside of the game, and we'll be able to craft our Tier 3 rocket. Whilst I was waiting for those to finish, I began experimenting with a new type of autonomous activator, one from Extra Utilities. It worked a lot faster than the other one. The only downside to this is that the actual wands themselves need to be recharged every so often. I just need to put them in my inventory, but that's a big hassle. We're going to have to solve that problem later, but for now, it'll work just fine. The next day, I set up one more autonomous activator with the hoe in it with Fortune 3. It wouldn't click every time, but occasionally it would get that block, and it would give me more output. My plates were almost finished at this point. I was then crafting the Tier 3 plates, which would be required to craft the Tier 3 rocket. And then, with all the crafting components prepared, I crafted my Tier 3 rocket, and I did my ritual of carrying my rocket into space, which is slightly ironic, but we'll get to that later. I ended off the day with fueling up my rocket and making the final preparations to go to Jupiter, Venus, and any other planet that needed a Tier 3 rocket. And then, at the dawn of the new day, I climbed into my Tier 3 rocket, which shook more than usual. It had me a little bit scared, and I ventured off to face the new planets and the new bosses that I would encounter. I had no idea what awaited me, as I had never gone this far inside of Galacticraft before. But I was ready. Without oxygen, but I was ready. Upon blasting off into space, I remembered that I forgot my oxygen and my oxygen mask. Oh well. The first planet I went to was not a planet at all, but the Asteroid Fields. I had heard that starships had crashed into these asteroids and there were remains everywhere. I wanted to salvage them and see what from past civilizations had remained up in space. I noticed an object that looked slightly different than all the other asteroids, and I ventured towards it, and sure enough, it was the wreck of an old ship. I had no idea what kind of technology they might have left behind, so I decided to go venture in and see what was inside. And then, as I ventured throughout the spaceship, I began looking into each different room. I realized that one of the rooms had weakness and poison potions in it. No one crafts these unless they want to. Oh my. I wonder what happened to these spaceships. In another room, there were some cryo chambers, but I couldn't see very well, so I went out and I grabbed one of those arc lamps and I placed it inside. There was no signs of life. But I decided it would be a fun idea to jump in one and see what happened. It turns out it just acts like a bed. How lame. After fully exploring the airship, I decided I would venture back into the asteroid field and just see what the asteroids were made of. There was nothing too interesting out here, so I eventually decided it was time to return back to the space station and go to a new planet. The next day, I launched off of an asteroid and I began my venture to a new planet, the planet of Venus. I knew it was going to be very hot there, and I had no protection from it, like literally at all. All I had was my armor, but I knew it would be able to upkeep at least with some of the damage I was taking, so I would be fine. I had no idea if bosses even existed on this planet, but I was determined to find out. As I began my descent onto Venus, I noticed a bunch of mobs with a greeting party. So nice of them to welcome me to their new planet. And then, after some adventuring, I was able to find the dungeon that held the final boss for the exploration mods of the solar system for now. I ventured through it, but I kept overheating and almost dying. So I used my transporter and I went back and forth from Earth to Venus so I could heal and then come back. And then eventually I made my way to the boss room and I began my assault. The only problem was she kept bringing herself up into a webbed area that I could not attack her in, and she didn't seem to ever want to get out of it. But eventually, she broke free of it, and I was able to destroy her, and I took her tier 2 key. Tier 3 key now. And I opened the chest up, and the loot was pretty lackluster, and I'm not quite sure why a tier 3 boss has that kind of loot, but I digress. It was now time to return to Earth and face the more pressing issues of the Chaos Dragon that was growing stronger and stronger by the day. Like, quite literally, he was growing immortal, and I needed to solve this issue before he was too strong. I began the next day by picking out some quartz blocks that I was going to use for a new structure. I knew if I wanted to fight the Chaos Dragon, I was going to need to be importing more resources so I could make the final game set armor, but to do that I was going to need more void ore miners. I didn't want to put them there randomly because that looks stupid, so I decided to make a cool looking structure for them, and I decided to pick out the blocks for it. I then built a pillar of glowstone and mined it so I could get the glowstone dust. I still didn't have an efficient way of doing this. I could simply have put it into a pulverizer, but I wanted to do it manually because manual labor builds character. I then began the crafting series. It would be good if I could have them crafting in the background whilst I built the new structure they were going to be in. I then found a location I wanted to place the new structure and began pillaring up with cobblestone. I was going to build the ore miners first and then build the structure around the ore miners. This way I would have everything evenly spaced out and it would look very pretty. I spent most of the next day building. I had no idea what I wanted to build, but I figured if I placed blocks, I'd eventually come up with something. That's the concept I usually work with building. It's a very dangerous idea to play around with, but nonetheless, it ended up working out just fine. As I built, I started thinking about the progress I would have to make to kill the Chaos Dragon. I knew I would need maxed out Draconic Armor, but to do that, I would need a lot of resources, as upgrading those tiers is quite costly in Nether Stars, Dragon Eggs, and come to think of it, I needed a way to get Dragon Eggs, because the only way currently to get it is by killing the Ender Dragon. And we've already established that that's not an option because he has way too much health, and that would take way too long unless you wanted me to remain the last 40 days killing him to get enough Dragon Eggs. So I needed to come up with a solution on how to get more Dragon Eggs to build that last tier armor, and how to fight the Chaos Dragon as quickly as possible. The longer that we wait, the more health and attack that he gets, and it's going to get absolutely crazy. If you hadn't noticed, when I attacked the Ender Dragon, he fully drained all of my armor with his first hit. If the Ender Dragon can do that, what can the Chaos Dragon do? After I finished the structure, I realized that the building was not at all to measurement. One side was longer than the other side, and I had no idea how it had happened. I spent the next 10 minutes staring at it, wondering what happened, and eventually I figured it out, broke down the structure, rebuilt it, and we had our finished project, which kind of looked like a pyramid, kind of looked like a weird-looking object in the distance, but nonetheless, it was the new building for the Void Ore Miners, and it would mine like nothing else. I I began the next day by working on some auto-crafting. I knew I was going to have all the void ore miners working at max capacity, and I wanted them built today. So I spent the entire day working on getting them built and getting the supplies ready that would be required to have all the resources imported and processed. I began the next day by working on my importing process. One ender chest was not fast enough to import all the resources we were now getting, so I set up a few more, put some importers on it, added some speed and stack upgrades, and it was enough to suffice how many resources were being imported into my ME system at one time. And finally, after a long enough time, I decided it was time to build walls on this thing so people stopped shooting me from the ground. I don't know what I did to them, but they repeatedly shot me no matter what I was doing. The next day, I made my way to the beach, and by the beach, I mean the desert, because there's no water here. Ha! Got 'em. I then decided to start mining a bunch of sand so I could smelt it down into glass. I was going to need a lot of glass for the upcoming projects if I was going to craft the new armor set. However, while I was here, the natives began attacking me and shooting me with their bows and arrows. Not exactly sure why they were upset that I was destroying their homeland, but I decided to just go with it and leave anyway. Ah, see, that's just a small chunk, it's not so bad. The first thing I did when I got home was craft an ultimate furnace. This would help me out immensely with the auto-crafting processes. I then began to work on a new source of power generation. Building a nuclear reactor to max capacity is fun and all, but it's not exactly an efficient use of time. I decided to go for solar panels instead, and although they emit less RF per tick, they're easier to build and they're easier to scale, so they actually emit more RF per time consumed. Ah, and there she was, my beautiful new ultimate furnace. Look at her smelt. Whilst minding my own business, I was attacked by another scout dragon. This reminded me that the Chaos Dragon was a foe that I had to start contending with soon. The next day was mainly a day waiting for me for things to finish auto-crafting, but while I was waiting, I added some more hearts. This is cute. And then I added some more stack upgrades and speed upgrades to my new import system. I was mainly waiting around for a bunch of things to finish crafting, so I could begin my start on making Draconic Armor, so I could start facing the ultimate foe, the Chaos Dragon. I began the next day by swapping out my Tier 4 Void Ore Miner for a Tier 4 Resource Miner. This would enable me to accumulate things like cobblestone, clay, and a lot of other things very quickly, which would be great for building reasons. I then placed down some vibrant capacitors as they would work for reserves for my power supply. And then I built my first solar panel. It would generate 52,000 RF per tick, which wasn't as much as my reactor, but it was way easier to build and way easier to build in mass quantities. After setting up my solar panels, I set up my vibrant capacitors to import and export RF. This would enable me to track how much I was using and how much I was losing, depending on what I was doing. I then turned my molecular transformer back on, and I watched it craft those wither skulls into stars like nobody's business. Now, it was time. Day 169. I began the day by crafting some more solar panels. I needed to expand my solar farm if I wanted to have everything done efficiently. I wanted 3 solar panels going at max performance. This would enable me to have enough power, because although my molecular transformer required a lot of power, so did the crafting components that would craft my new Draconic Armor. They eat power like nothing else, so I would need a big reserve of it if I wanted to craft these new items. I also created a ton of flux that day. This would enable me to make a bunch of flux points for the new upcoming crafting I was about to do. The Draconic Armor was nigh, and the Chaos Dragon was coming soon. I had no idea if I'd be able to face him, or if I would just die at the attempt. But I needed to attempt it, or else it was all in vain. I began the next day by placing a bunch of flux points. I was going to connect them to my new crafters, so I could fusion craft all the items I would need to make the next tier. I was going to begin my quest to make Draconic Armor, but first of all, I needed some Wyvern cores, and to make Wyvern cores, I needed my basic tier setup with all the tier... The next day, after realizing that my flux points did not connect to any of my crafters, I decided to do a workaround, and I crafted some cryo-stabilized flux ducts. These would act as infinite power sources to all of my crafters as long as they were supplied with power from a flux point. After a few days, my Wyvern cores were complete, and the next stage was to make my Wyvern crafters. But to do that, I was going to have to set up an entirely new injecting system and put in some basic crafting cells to then be merged into the Wyvern crafting injector. Whilst my crafting injectors were being made, I decided that the next thing I should do is make some dragon eggs. Yes, you heard me, make some dragon eggs. The molecular transformer can transfer onyx blocks into dragon eggs themselves, and I'd put some onyx ores inside of a pulverizer a bit earlier, so now I had a bunch of blocks. I put them in the molecular transformer, and boom, we had some dragon eggs. This would be essential for crafting a little bit later. At the dawn of the new day, I placed down my Wyvern fusion crafting injectors, and they were ready to go. This was essential because I was going to have to make the Draconic Injectors if I wanted to make Draconic Armor, which is the final endgame armor that we would need to take on the Chaos Dragon. Whilst I was waiting for some things to craft, I began crafting up the components that would be required to make the Staff of Power. This is a highly regarded weapon inside of Draconic Evolution that does the max amount of damage you can do inside of the game, aside of one other weapon that we'll get into a bit later. To end off the day, I set up the crafting injector to begin crafting the Draconic Injectors. This would be the final stage before we could craft the ultimate armor set and begin to upgrade it. Day 175. This was a big day. I began the day by creating some more drives. I was running out of storage once again. We needed a way to permanently solve this, but for now we're going to leave it as be. The next thing I did was craft the Draconic Injectors. It was time to begin the crafting process. To craft the Draconic Suit, I was going to need one more item, an Awakened Core. This was only crafted using the Wyvern Injectors, so I got it started. Once I was able to craft these, I'd be able to construct the final endgame armor. And then it was time. I put my Wyvern armor pieces in and began transforming them into the final Draconic set of armor. This was a big moment for me because it meant I was basically invincible. Well, we would soon find out that might be slightly wrong, but I had very strong armor now, and it was time to begin upgrading it and to make it an unstoppable force of nature. I ended off the day by crafting a bunch of different upgrades. These could be put inside of the injectors and applied to the corresponding armor pieces at each tier. I was going to be spending the next few days upgrading this armor to the max caliber it could go. And then the upgrading process begins. For those of you who don't know how this works, you have to put an upgradable item inside of the injectors. From there, it's going to require a certain set of resources depending on its tier, anywhere from basic, wyvern, to draconic. The basic tiers apply the least amount of upgrades, but they also require the least amount of materials. And as you move your way up through the systems, they require more materials and more expensive items. But that would not stop us, because at this point with our void ore miners, we had every resource we could ever want. And it was time now to do all of the upgrading that would lead us to the final battle of the game, the Chaos Guardian, who guarded the Chaos Shards, which would enable us to craft an item that would make us so unstoppable, even the Titans would fear us. I began the next day by adding infinity to my bow. It was going to be the ultimate weapon for taking down the Chaos Dragon, as he's way too fast for me to hit him with my Staff of Power. I then began to tweak each profile for my weapon and for my armor. Every single type of Draconic Armor has a config that you can tweak, and when you apply upgrades to it, you can tweak it even more. I made sure my bow had the max arrow velocity modifiers on, and the arrow of Draconic Fire. The arrow of Draconic Fire is a pure energy blast, which absolutely obliterates any foe in its path, but it consumes a lot of RF. I then had some volunteers test my new bow out. It works terrifically on them. The final volunteer was the Ender Dragon. I began pelting him with my arrows, and I was able to take him down, which I acquired another heart from. Now I could start mining even more Draconium, and I could get the final upgrades on my armor. But no time for that. It was time to face off the Chaos Dragon. As I began my quest to find the Chaos Guardian Island, I could only think to myself, is this the peak of the series? Is there nothing left past this? Will we even pass it ourselves? If we are to die in the next moments to come, what will be the point of all of this? I had all of these questions, and I didn't have any answers. But as I passed by the terrain, and I remembered everything we had accomplished so far, I could only think, we can't lose. We've come too far. As the Chaos Dragon fell to our bow, we began to mine down to remove his shards. The shards are the last item we would need to complete Draconic Evolution and to claim mastery over the mod. Once I'd claimed them, I backed up, as the Chaos Shards held the island together, and once they were mined, the island would explode into nothingness. As I watched the island explode, I could only think to myself, I had done it. But this was not the ending. I spent the next day working on Vi's airships. I had still had no idea how to work these things, and I attempted to fly one off the edge, but unfortunately it just fell straight to the bottom. After doing some research and some tinkering, I found out that it actually requires a fuel source, and after I imported it in, sure enough, I had a flying airship. I'm not exactly sure who would use these things as they're slow as heck, but they were kind of cool. The next day, I focused on a slightly sinister idea. I wanted to test out turrets. I had an idea of what I could use them for should they work effectively enough, so I decided to use some more volunteers to see how the turrets worked. Yes, very, very nice. This will do just fine. After doing some crafting, the next day I began setting up my Ring of Death. I wanted to somehow automate the spawning and killing of the Ender Dragon. This would be both effective for Ender Dragon hearts, and just because it leaves us as Pog champs. And then, after my Circle of Death was completed, I spawned in a new Ender Dragon, and they began to pelt him with rockets and minigun ammo. But it took a little while to take him down, all of about 30 seconds, and that just won't do. I spent most of the next day tinkering with a new idea. I needed a way to get infinite gunpowder if I was going to construct a bunch of rockets to have them infinitely propelled into my new turrets. So the best way to do that was to automate creepers spawning and to gather their TNT. The next day, after acquiring all the gunpowder I would need, I began the auto-crafting process to craft a lot more turrets. I'm not really about this manual labor. And then I made the Ring of Death even bigger inside of the end. But still, it took them 2 shots before it took him down, and I was not going to put up with this nonsense. It took me a few more days, and I wouldn't exactly call this a death circle, it's more like a death farmland, but nonetheless I constructed it, and I spawned in a new Ender Dragon, and sure enough, he was one-shotted. Mission completed. And then I did it again because I'm sinister like that. The next day I began work on Avaricia, and I crafted some neutronium collectors. What these do are they enable you to collect neutronium dust. From there you can craft it into nuggets, and from there into ingots. And from there you can use the ingots to craft infinity ingots, and from the infinity ingots you can craft the ultimate armor and weapons inside of the entire modded community. But this was far away from our reach for now. But it would give us a good start and enable us to begin our quest for ultimate dominance. No matter how big that difficulty meter got, we would be unkillable. Day 200. I spent the day reminiscing on old times, and I went to visit some of the original sites that we had started off this 200-day saga in. I remember being down in the mines, quivering in fear. I was never quivering in fear, but let's just say I was quivering in fear. From all the dangerous mobs above. The fireballs that were shot at me, the many different monsters that tried to chase me down in the early days and continue to chase me down for some reason, not quite sure why. Ah, the good times. And now, as we face the last test, the ultimate armor set, I can only wonder, could anything kill us? And as the sun set on the final day, my new quest towards infinity ingots and the infinity armor and tool sets had only just begun. But I knew once achieved, I would be literally unkillable. Ah, it felt good.